Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Tim Hooker, and as convener of our programme of the BIOFILMS Science Lectures, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all, and especially to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Maurice Tucker, who's going to tell us all about viruses, the new frontier in earth science. Indeed, we're fortunate that Professor Tucker is already a familiar face at BIOFILMS, having previously given a talk on fossil plants and, back in 2019, led members and visitors on a geology-guided tour of our city of Bath, the cradle of English geology. And who better? Maurice is a leading British sedimentologist with a particular specialism in limestones. Now, I'd previously arranged for Maurice to present his evening lecture to us last November, but of course COVID restrictions thwarted those plans without occasion. And so it's especially exciting as things begin to get back to some degree of normality that we can now enjoy hearing Maurice tell us about an entirely new, refreshing and non-threatening view of viruses that will completely change our disease-centered perception of these submicroscopic pathogens. Okay, until 10 years ago, Maurice had been Professor of Geological Sciences at Durham University, rising to become Master of the University College there. Since then, he's now Professor at the School of Earth Sciences at Bristol University, where he's actively running several projects. And one of those involves understanding the role of viruses in carbonate precipitation of microbialites, that's rocks formed by microbial action. Indeed, it's perhaps through his passion of scuba diving during diving in exotic warm locations that stony microbial mats of algae and bacteria caught his interest. And this will feature in his talk to us this evening, explaining why viruses have become of such importance in geology. So before we begin, may I remind everybody to keep your microphone muted throughout the talk and with your video camera turned off. And if you wish to ask a question, and I hope of course you will, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen so that Maurice can answer your questions at the end of his presentation. Alternatively, at the end of the talk, if you raise your hand and wave, I can invite you in that way. But it's often quite helpful if you write your question in through the chat button. So, Maurice, it's my very great pleasure at last to welcome you to our BOS audience this evening. And please tell us about viruses, the new frontier in earth science. Thank you.
Okay, so, all right. We're set now. Good. So thank you for inviting me to give this presentation about fossil viruses. And it's my pleasure to speak to the BRLSI. I'm very pleased to be a member of the institution. And I suppose I'm also representing the Bath Geological Society, having been a member for the 10 years since I came to this part of the world. So this is my interest at the moment, or one of them, fossil viruses. And there's a team of us, as you can see from the list of people there, that are working on this topic, coming from Warsaw, Krakow, Calabria, Durham, and also from the university, one of the universities here in Bath. Okay, so this evening I'd like to first of all start giving you a little bit of background to viruses. Then I'll be talking about the presence of bacteria and viruses in microbial mats, and how viruses are mineralized there. In other words, they're fossilized. Then, because they can be fossilized, we'll talk about the geological record of viruses. And we ought to say something about the good things that viruses do, because they have been getting a rather bad press, of course, in the last year and a half. And then we'll explore what viruses can do within the earth sciences and how they can be involved in natural environmental processes, things especially like precipitation of minerals. We've been carrying out some experiments of precipitating calcium carbonate, calcite, with viruses, so I'll tell you about that. And the other thing we should think about is whether viruses might be involved in extinction. Right, so viruses, the new frontier in geology, do they play a role? So let's go. Well, you'll all know something about fossils, I'm sure. You'll have seen fossils. You only have to go and wander in Victoria Park here the Royal Victoria Park, I should say, sorry, across the road from where I'm sitting. I can see it. And if you walk around there, you'll find some ammonites. In fact, you can find many ammonites. In one part of the park, you can see some bivalves. These are Gryphea, the devil's toenail. If you go further afield, you can find fossil plants like down at Radstock. And if you really are interested in dinosaurs, then if you go to Glamorgan, South Wales, Barry, Penarth, then you can find some dinosaur footprints. They're all common types of fossil. But how do you fossilize a virus? A virus is, for a start, it doesn't have any hard parts like some of these other fossils. It's just made of organic matter. And of course, it's so small. Right, so just a bit of background quickly. Viruses are absolutely everywhere. And in fact, they're more abundant than bacteria. We're always we were talking more about bacteria than viruses. Now we're not. But they are present in 10 to 100 times more than bacteria. So seawater, in just a milliliter of water, which is a tiny amount of water, you can have 10 billion viruses, enormous numbers. So in terms of numbers, as you can see from this abundance diagram here on the left, blue being the viruses, they are by far the most abundant biological entity on Earth. They occur in sediments, soil, just like bacteria. It can be shallow water, it can be deep water. They occur in all environments. They occur in hot springs, cold springs, glaciers, in many places, even down in the deep subsurface. Where you find bacteria, you will find viruses. And of course, they're coming down in the rain. And the question then comes, could they be on Mars? People are looking actively at the moment, of course. Well, not people, rovers. And could they be in the atmosphere of Venus, as we heard in the news a couple of months ago? But if you look at the volume, the mass that viruses constitute, then actually it's much smaller than bacteria. So if you look over here at this diagram showing the biomass, the actual weight of the viruses, you'll see here the viruses here in blue, they are really swamped by the prokaryotes, by the bacteria. So they're really only a small percentage when you start to look at the volume of or the mass compared with bacteria. But of course, we've got plenty of bacteria within our body. And in fact, about 200 grams of ourselves are the bacteria. 200 grams, that's like a smallish packet of butter. And the weight of the viruses present in our body would be about 10 grams. Well, if you think of 10 grams, what's 10 grams? Well, Wikipedia tell you what weights are in simple terms. 10 grams is 10 raisins. So there we are. And the number of viruses in our body, 380 trillion. It's incredible when you think about it. Okay, now a few words about the shapes and sizes of viruses. They are incredibly tiny. You can see the figure, tens to hundreds of nanometers. That is very small. 1,000 nanometers in a micron and 1,000 microns in a millimeter. So you can see we're dealing about things which are tiny, really tiny. So bacteria are tens to hundreds of nanometers. Bacteria are about a micron, bit less, to a few tens of microns. Should just mention the bacteria are single cells. They're prokaryotes. They don't have a nucleus. They do have DNA and they do have some structures, organelles inside them. Bacteria produce simply by dividing asexually by binary fission, dividing into two. Now, with viruses, though, there's been a lot of argument. They are somewhere between living and not living, which seems a bit strange. And they have a shell around the outside made of proteins, and inside, that's where you have some nucleic acid, which carries the genetic information relating to that virus. Some viruses have an envelope around the outside, and that's the part that might be spiky, as in the coronavirus. And of course, we now, every day, many times a day, we see pictures of coronavirus on the TV or in the newspaper. The shapes of viruses, lots of variety, as you can see from some of these images here. But actually, the majority of the viruses that occur in the sea, in lakes, that occur in natural environment, the majority are more or less spherical. They're spherical, but they've got sides. In other words, they are icosahedral. That's the word. They have about 20 sides. They're a bit like an old-fashioned football, round, but with flat surfaces. So that's the shape, useful to know. Viruses are entirely dependent on a host for replication. Viruses can't live by themselves. So that's why they're often referred to as parasites, intracellular parasites. They need a cell on which to feed. So they're very simple. They only reproduce inside host cells. They can't reproduce by themselves. That's why people are not really sure whether they're living or not. So the virus comes along, injects its DNA into a cell, as you can see down the bottom here. New viruses develop within the cell. Then they grow, tens, maybe 100 viruses grow inside the cell or inside the bacterium, and then they burst out. That's called lysis, and then they can go and infect other bacteria, other cells. So viruses are closely associated bacteria. They need bacteria. And of course, they are also in organisms, they're in us, and they need our cells to replicate themselves. The other thing to mention about viruses is that they have a negative charge. So they can attract metals, elements which have a positive charge, like we will call them cations. So they can attract elements to themselves. That's a very important mechanism in terms of precipitation. And then there's something else I have to tell you about, and that's EPS, extracellular polymeric substance. That is mucus or mucilage. It's a bit like snot, really, but this EPS occurs around bacteria and other organisms. That also has a negative charge. We'll mention EPS a little bit later. So one place where we see a lot of bacteria are microbial mats, and therefore we will see large numbers of viruses associated with the bacteria in microbial mats. Microbial mats give rise to microbialites, rocks made by microbes, and they occur throughout the geological record. And they are the evidence for life beginning on Earth, the microbialites. You might have also come across them as stromatolites. So we need to go and look at microbial mats. So here are some pictures of microbial mat. They usually occur in warm places. Some of them are very pleasant. Some are a bit sticky and too hot. But anyway, you can see microbial mats, top left there, covering the intertidal zone. That's in Abu Dhabi. So you have a layer of cyanobacteria and other things across the surface. We call it a biofilm. And if you dig a hole here, spade, held by the wife, and here's a research student, you need some research students, pushing in a drain pipe into the sediment to take a sample. This is what you see, laminated sediment here, organic layers, layers of lime mud. Here's the famous place, Shark Bay in Western Australia. I'm sure you'll have seen that on David Attenborough films. These are very famous stromatolites, and here are some subtidal stromatolites, always underwater in the Bahamas. So they are microbial mats, microbialites. So just a few quick words about microbialites. Microbial mats consist of the cyanobacteria, other bacteria, archaea, so they're like bacteria if you like, green algae, fungi, diatoms, and the EPS, the mucilage. the mucus, which are secreted by the bacteria, and viruses. You get plenty of viruses, and all this makes a biofilm. So within this microbial mat, you will often find precipitates, minerals being precipitated, and you'll also see sediment being trapped by the mucus, by the bacteria. In other words, it builds up to form a sediment, a rock. It forms the microbialite. The microbes, the bacteria, many of these are photosynthesizing, extracting carbon dioxide from the air or from the water, and that helps in the precipitation of calcium carbonate. So they are microbial mats, biofilm, but very closely related to these are tufa, which you might well have come across. It's been in the news recently, tufa field up near English Combe Lane, and travertine. Travertine, maybe you've got some travertine in your kitchen. It's often used as worktops or in bathrooms, and travertine is being formed in the Roman baths at the present time. Tufa from cold water, travertine from hot water springs. And of course, also related will be the bacteria that live in the sea. There are billions and billions of bacteria there with their EPS, their mucus around them to protect them, and their viruses. So they are microbialites. Now, if you want to see some spectacular biofilms, if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, all you have to do is go to the Roman baths. You'll see the biofilms floating around there. This picture on the right, floating around on the surface of the Great Bath. Or if you look at the steps of the Great Bath, you'll see this coating, this green slimy coating. Look at the bubbles. That's the oxygen coming off from the bacteria, which are photosynthesizing. These are biofilms, and that's a good place to go. Very easy to see the biofilms. Okay, so if we look at the distribution of stromatolites, microbialites through the geological record, here we go back through geological time, 600, you go from Cambrian into the Precambrian, and then you go back into the much older rocks, the Proterozoic, the Archean, back to about 4 billion years. All the way through these different time periods, we see microbialites, stromatolites, calcium microbes, all the way back to about 4,000 million years old. In terms of actual fossils, actual fossil bacteria, then we don't see these anything really before about 3.5 billion years. But the stromatolites, the microbes, which are made by the bacteria, go back to about 4 billion years. So just to show you some ancient stromatolites, microbialites, this is up in Finnmark in northern Norway, a place I went to a long time ago. And you can see the beautiful stromatolites here. Lovely part of the world, apart from mosquitoes. But here you see these stromatolites growing up as they were on the seafloor. In this case, about 1,000 million years ago. And here's a stromatolite, rather flat, laminated rock, like the sort of microbial mats I was showing you from Abu Dhabi. And of course, we have a very famous microbialite here in the West Country, coming from the Bristol area, coming from the suburb of Cottam. This is the Cottam marble, called landscape marble from the old days, because this looked like trees growing up, trees, and forming like miniature forest here. But this is a stromatolite here. You can see the domes, you can see the flat-lying stromatolite at the bottom. You can go to the Cottam suburb in Bristol, and you can see this marble on some pillars in 1 or 2 streets there. Absolutely beautiful. But it's only about 6 inches thick, about 15, 20 centimeters, this layer of rock, but you can find it over a large area of the southwest here. Okay, so one of the things we've been doing is looking at modern microbial mats, and you can see modern mats here. We started this project probably about 6-7 years ago, because we were interested in microbial mats, and you can see this huge extent of black microbial mat on the east side of the QATAR Peninsula in the Arabian Gulf. You can see the microbial mats. We thought they might be hydrocarbon source rocks, so we started to look at these. So you can see the mat here is a team of students and one professor there, here with the orange, Fiona Whitaker. Looking at the microbial mats there in QATAR, collecting water samples, collecting samples of the mat itself. So when you look with the electron microscope at this mat, you can see the filamentous bacteria and the COCCOID, the roundish bacteria. Now, when we start to look in more detail with the scanning electron microscope at a higher magnification, then we start to see some really exciting things. Here you can see a bacterium here. This is a COCCOID bacteria, about 2 microns in length. But you'll see all the way around, all this stuff here, it's got tiny little round structures. We call them nanospheres. These nanospheres, they all have about the same size, as you can see. This is about 70 to 100 nanometers. But look at the shape. They're all roundish nanospheres. But actually, if you look closely, you'll see they're not perfect spheres. They've got sort of edges to them. They're just slightly off from being a sphere. So we think this is the icosahedral shape, which was the shape of the viruses originally, but here they are in the microbial mat. So we think these are viruses that we are looking at. They're the right size, they're the right shape, and they're all about the same size. There are other possibilities for what they can be, but that's what we think these are. Now, if you can also see in here, the EPS, you see these strands here. This is the mucus. It's dried a little bit, but that's the mucus, the EPS, which was over the surface of this microbial mat. Now, let's have a closer look. Well, here we can see this bacterium, but look, these little round things, they're stuck on this bacterium. These are the viruses which are attacking, infecting this bacterium. That's how we interpret that picture. And here you can see lots of these very tiny round particles, and they're forming a cluster. They're sort of congregating together. But look at this one up here. Look at several of them. You see, they are not perfectly spherical. They have this icosahedral shape. They're all of a similar size. We think these are viruses within the microbial mat. Okay, now the very exciting thing is that when you use a different type of viewing for the scanning electron microscope, what we call backscatter, you can see something really special. So here on the left, same picture we had before. This is what the image looks like. That's as you see it, like that. But here on the right, we've got a different technique which picks out the atomic number of the elements making up the field of view. And if something has a higher atomic number, then it tends to be a lighter color. So in this field of view, it's exactly the same field of view as the one on the left, you can't really see the bacteria. It's not, you can only just about make it out. That's because the bacterium, you're more or less seeing through it, because it's got, it's made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which are very low atomic number elements. But see the other areas, they're looking very bright. And why is that? Because they have elements concentrated there: calcium, magnesium, silicon, and iron. They've been picked up by the EPS, by the viruses. In other words, they are mineralized. They have turned from organic matter into the beginnings of minerals. And you can see these clusters very clearly. They're tending to amalgamate, coalesce. But our bacterium here, with its tiny little viruses, that has not been mineralized, not yet anyway. So that's really exciting to find that. Anyway, if we can use another microscope, this one's called a transmission electron microscope. Now you've got a very thin slice through this microbial mat. You can see the bacteria, okay, these round things, here we are, and here's one. Now, in this case, anything that's dark is made of mineral matter. So you can see all these dark grains around the outside. That is where the mucus is, the EPS, and what's happened is they are being changed to minerals. So these organic particles there, which we think were viruses, are now changing to mineral. That's really staggering. Nobody had ever seen this before we found it 2 years ago. Okay, and this just to sort of prove it, here you can see a couple of bacteria, these round things here, top left, and then around it, you can see the EPS, the mucus. And when you look at the distribution of the elements, this one here is calcium. This warm color means there's a lot of calcium here. So this is high calcium occurring around the bacterium. Bit of magnesium, you can just about make out the pattern in there. Some sulfur, bit of aluminium, and silicon as well. So that's what's happened. The EPS, the viruses have picked up these elements because they are negatively charged and are starting to make minerals around the bacteria. Very exciting. Now here, and also with the TEM, the transmission electron microscope, here you can see a COCCOID bacterium. And notice it's full of round structures. If you look carefully, you'll see they've got a bit of sort of color to them. They're not transparent, and they've got a little bit of darkness developing. Around the outside, this is the EPS, the mucus, and you can see it's got lots of threads there, and they are gradually getting darker because they're being mineralized. So these particles are gradually turning to mineral. In other words, they're being fossilized. And here you can see the same thing with a couple of bacteria and lots of round particles, all about the same size, all roughly spherical, and all sort of getting darker because they're being mineralized, they're being fossilized. So we've got fossilized viruses here. Well, these sort of things have not been described in microbial mats before, but somebody did about 8 years ago describe some viruses from a hot spring in China. And in this case, they are being mineralized too, but they're being mineralized by silica. So in hot springs, you often have silica being precipitated, and that's what's happened here. So another example of viruses involved in precipitation and becoming fossilized, in this case by silica, whereas in the microbial mats, it's by calcite. Well, so what about then the geological history of viruses? We have shown by looking at modern microbial mats that the viruses can be mineralized, they can be fossilized. So how far back do viruses go? Well, many people believe that viruses go right back to the beginning of life. And in fact, some people actually suggest that viruses were there before life began, because viruses are not quite living, but viruses are like the first stage in the development of life, some people might suggest. There are other explanations for the origin of viruses, that they came along a bit later, but I think the most likely is that they were there before life really took off. So when did life begin? I mentioned earlier about 4 billion years ago. We see the first stromatolites about that time, but it's not till about 3.2 billion years ago that we find the first bacterial cells. So we would therefore expect to find viruses fossilized back in those early days. In fact, viruses would have been created in that warm little pond that Charles Darwin talked about. Okay, so we would expect them to go all the way back, but nobody has bothered yet to think about the geological history of viruses. This is completely open, new game. But how do we recognize them? Well, I've mentioned a few things already. Size, particular size range. Normally you'll find large numbers of them. They might all be of a similar size. And then the shape, nanospheres, but with this shape, which is not a true sphere, icosahedral, flat sides. The problem is, though, they may join together, as I showed, they might coalesce. So it may not be quite so easy to recognize. Got to be careful. And then the context, as I've said, viruses are associated with cells and with bacteria. So if you've got stromatolites, that's the place to look for viruses and looking for bacteria as well. Wherever you had biofilms, you would expect to find viruses and bacteria too. And then the mineralogy, as I've said, the ones in the microbial mats tend to be calcite, calcium carbonate. There could be aragonite, that's also calcium carbonate. There could be dolomite, that's calcium magnesium carbonate. The problem with these minerals is they can recrystallize. They can grow to be bigger. So it might be difficult to recognize viruses there, but maybe not. We've got to look. And then silica, as I mentioned, viruses can be replaced by silica in hot springs. Silica generally is less susceptible to recrystallization. So if we have any hot spring deposits in the geological record, we should look closely, see if there are any viruses there, fossilized viruses. And then iron minerals. We know that bacteria are very much involved in the precipitation of iron. There are different processes, reduction, bacterial sulfate reduction. The bacteria live in low oxygen conditions. That's where siderite and pyrite are formed. So we might well expect to find viruses associated with iron minerals. But the point is, we should find viruses throughout the geological record. But up to now, of course, nobody has really looked. In fact, it's only since we started publishing about this 2 years ago that people have started to look. So there was a paper published this year showing these tiny small particles in a chert, just like flint, and they interpreted these as silicified viruses. So that's a good start. But if you go, there are many, many pictures in the literature where you can now go back and have a look. People have described EPS. You see this structure here. It looks like a mucus which has been calcified. But if you look very carefully, you'll see there are tiny, tiny particles in here. Look at these little particles in here. And here, slight higher magnification. See all these round structures? Well, these are probably calcified viruses. These are nanospheres. So perhaps that's what we have. But a few years ago, people hadn't thought about looking for viruses. So now's the time to go back and look in the literature. Like here, here's a fantastic example of what could be viruses. This is about nearly 2 billion years old, 2,000 million years. You see, this is a piece of, this is chert, this is silica. You see all these tiny round things here. These are the right size. Look at the shape. They're slightly odd. They're not quite perfect spheres. They look like the icosahedral shapes. These all could be viruses. This picture, published in a paper 10 years ago, maybe they saw them, but didn't know what they were. So that's what we're looking for now. Going back through the geological record, see if we can find evidence for the viruses. Okay, well, so we've got fossils. We're fossilizing viruses now. And when we go back in the geological record, I think we'll find lots of evidence for viruses there. But what else could viruses get up to? Well, they've had such bad press, of course, in the last year and a half. You'd think that all viruses were bad, but that's not the case. Actually, I'm sure viruses do more good than bad. One of the really, really important things about viruses is they are involved in the biogeochemical cycles of the Earth. In other words, they recycle organic matter. If it wasn't for viruses, then organic matter will build up on the seafloor. But viruses break it down. They attack bacteria and destroy them. It's reckoned that 80% of all the bacteria in the sea are dying more or less continuously because of viruses. But what it's doing is releasing the goodness in organic matter. The nitrogen, the carbon, the phosphorus is being released for other organisms. That stimulates other bacteria to grow, and that's the bottom of the food chain. So they are really, really important in breaking down organic matter and providing nutrients. Base of the food chain, the viruses providing food for all the other organisms. It's also people are beginning to realize that viruses in the sea prevent certain bacteria from taking over. If bacteria begin to explode in their populations, viruses come along and seem to control it. So viruses allow a broader diversity of species within the bacteria in the oceans and presumably in lakes as well. And it's reckoned that viruses are very important at making their hosts better suited for the environment, improving the gene pool, things like that. So viruses actually are hugely significant. Some people say without bacteria, without the viruses, there would be no life. But what else do viruses do for the Earth? What's the other roles do they have in Earth sciences? Well, one of the things, of course, is in the precipitation of calcium carbonate, as we were saying with the microbial mats and perhaps other rocks. So limestones. Well, you can go everywhere, anywhere in the world, throughout the geological record, and you will find lots of limestones, calcium carbonate. We're sitting on limestone here in Bath. This building I'm in is made of limestone. But how is it formed? How does limestone form? Well, of course, some limestone is formed from corals and shells and algae, but there are many, many fine-grained limestones made of lime mud. Where did it come from? Here's a spectacular, one of my favorite parts of the world, the Dolomites in northern Italy. All this rock is limestone or dolomite. It's all very fine-grained. How did it get there? What precipitated it? And there are plenty more limestones. Here's some places that I've enjoyed working, like the Avon Gorge and Sunderland. Sunderland has some beautiful coast there. This is Lot's wife. Lot's wife. It will fall down before long, I'm sure. And these are other places that I've been working. But we have a good example of a lime mud, a fine-grained limestone, right on our doorsteps here. And that's the white lias. You must all have seen the white lias every time you drive through Keynsham or Bitton. So if you go to Bristol, you will go past houses built, and this is a good example, Keynsham Old Manor, made of white lias. And here is the white lias. It's a very fine-grained piece of limestone, beautiful white limestone, extremely fine-grained. How was it precipitated? Was it precipitated just out of seawater? Why? It would be easier to precipitate if there was something triggering the precipitation of calcium carbonate from seawater, something like the bloom of bacteria with their viruses. Okay, so we need to go back to the microbial mats, go back to QATAR. And here we are, microbial mats again. This is a place called the Inland Sea between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, corallidied. Here you can see the microbial mat with the different layers. We've already said that within the microbial mat, viruses are being mineralized, but also there are many minerals being precipitated here within the mat. So look, here you can see spectacular bundles of calcite. Amazing, beautiful SEM images. Here you see calcite crystals. growing up, you see, and they grow into crystals. You can see the crystal face developing. There's a hole in the middle. The hole gradually disappears as the crystal grows. But what's making the crystal grow? We also find dolomite in the microbial mat. There's a ROM of dolomite. And we find clay minerals in the microbial mat, all being precipitated there. But how are they being precipitated? It's not easy to precipitate minerals. If you want to precipitate something directly out of water so that it magically precipitates down, then the water has to be really supersaturated. And that's called homogeneous nucleation. So the water is so full of the chemicals, it has to precipitate. But to get water like that, seawater, so that it's so concentrated that things precipitate, you have to evaporate it. A better way of precipitating minerals is by having seeds or nuclei, and that's heterogeneous nucleation. So if you've got tiny particles there, they can act as the nucleus for the precipitation of the crystals. It's like seeding for rain. If you put some dust up there on a heavy day, you can make it rain. It's much easier to precipitate things if you've got nuclei. And the nuclei, of course, they are the mineralized viruses. So we think these tiny, tiny particles, tens of nanometers in size, which are calcified by the calcium carbonate in the microbial mat, being attracted to the virus, we think they are the nuclei for the precipitation of these crystals. So these crystals begin to grow on these really, really tiny particles to produce the calcite or whatever mineral you're talking about. We suggest that viruses are the seeds for crystal growth. That is their role in precipitating all the limestone we see. So we've been carrying out some experiments with viruses. We took the E. coli bacteria. These are my chums in Warsaw and Krakow. They got some E. coli bacteria and extracted all the viruses that were associated with it, making absolutely certain, here are the viruses, you can see them, there was no bits of bacteria in these, in the fluid they ended up with. So we used the viruses to precipitate calcium carbonate. So we had some calcium chloride, we added some sodium carbonate, and we had 1 billion viruses per mil. I don't know how they counted them. It'd be very interesting to know how they know they had 1 billion. But anyway, that's what my microbiologist chums tell me. So they put these two solutions together with all the viruses. And of course, they had some control experiments with no viruses. And lo and behold, precipitate calcium carbonate. So here you can see what was precipitated. These nanospheres, microspheres, you can see these structures. All these were precipitated by the activities of the viruses. And they grow to larger spheroid structures. But if you look at the smallest precipitates, there were a large proportion of the stuff precipitated was really, really tiny. Look at these. Look at the shape. These shapes. Look at that one there. That is icosahedral. That is a calcified virus. So the other interesting thing, apart from precipitating all this calcium carbonate through the viruses, is that they preferentially precipitated a different type of calcium carbonate, something called vaterite. Doesn't really matter what it is. It's a calcium carbonate like calcite, but it's unstable. So the viruses do have an influence in precipitating carbonate in terms of the crystals, the shape, the size, the fact they coagulate, they coalesce, as you can see up here, and the mineralogy. So there we are, it works. Viruses can be involved in calcium carbonate precipitation. And in fact, there is something that's puzzled people for a long time, right back to the last century. People have noticed that every now and again, in some parts of the world, the sea turns white. It's called a whiting. Here you can see a whiting in Abu Dhabi. Here in the Bahamas, you can see areas where the sea is all white. It suddenly goes white. And what's happening is calcium carbonate is being precipitated there. Well, what we would say is this is a bloom of bacteria. The bacteria suddenly grow in the sea, and with them the viruses, and the viruses become mineralized, and they are the seeds for the precipitation of this calcium carbonate. So why would the bacteria bloom in the first place? Suddenly large numbers of bacteria develop? Well, could be related to a changing climate, could be related to dust, like volcanic dust. In fact, a lot of dust, not volcanic, but a lot of dust is blowing more or less continuously out of the Sahara across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. The dust carries iron, and other nutrients, and this could promote bacteria growing rapidly in the warm, shallow seas of the Caribbean with their viruses, bringing about the precipitation of lime mud. Wow. What else have we got? Well, of course, in Bath, we've got ooids, oolite, Bath stone, this spectacular building stone. Here's a lump of Bath stone from a house in Pulteney Street. And you can see the cross bedding. You can just about make out the tiny grains. Here you can see the ooids here. And properly formed in a place like this. This is Jules's Key in the Bahamas. This is a place we went to a few years ago to do some research, honestly. And beautiful location. If you go a bit of scuba diving or snorkeling, then you see the seafloor with these dunes migrating along subaqueous dunes like you see here, there. And these are the ooids formed on the seafloor. But now people think they're microbial. People think that these ooids are precipitated by bacteria. There was a paper published recently, bacteria precipitating ooids. That's fine, very good. But look at these pictures. These pictures are full of tiny nanospheres. You see them here. These are the ooids down the electron microscope, full of nanospheres. What are nanospheres? They are viruses that have been calcified. The paper didn't mention viruses at all. There we are. Ooids, like we get in the Bath stone, maybe they are the result of viral precipitation of calcium carbonate. That's exciting, don't you think? That we've got a city here made of viruses. Apart from calcium carbonate, calcite, as I mentioned, the viruses can also be precipitating iron. People have seen this, in fact. There was a paper published quite a while ago, 15 years ago, showing viruses in the Rio Tinto River in Spain, but precipitating iron. And of course, a lot of iron in the geological record is a very important resource. This is something called abandoned iron formation. Many people are now beginning to think that maybe viruses are involved in the precipitation of ore deposits. So you need the bacteria there, and then the viruses come along, produce these tiny particles, in this case of iron, which are the seeds for the precipitation of more and more iron. All very exciting stuff. And then, of course, the one thing which you wonder about with the pandemic, with the coronavirus, what about the viruses being involved in extinction? This is extinction is something we seem to be very worried about. Obviously, if we are causing extinction, that's terrible. But actually, you look at the geological record, extinction events are going on all the time. They have them. And of course, extinction events are what are behind the area of earth sciences called biostratigraphy. William Smith, he was the first biostratigrapher. He was the first person to notice that the ammonites were different in the different layers around Bath. Why different ammonites? Because some became extinct and others evolved to take their place. So we have two types of extinction. we have mass extinctions, and we have the background extinctions. So mass extinctions, there have only been about 6 of these, and these are ones we hear about: meteorite impact, volcanism, climate change, etc. Extinction of the dinosaurs and all that. But all the time, there are background extinctions going on, which are a bit more subtle, particular species becoming extinct and new ones evolving. And of course, it's very likely that the viruses are involved in this process. Bacteria and the viruses working together, poisoning, if you like, diseases for particular species, which then die out, and other ones, stronger ones, come along to take over. But this is an area that nobody has really started to think about. Maybe it's time. And finally, yes, finally, what about viruses on Mars? Well, of course, Perseverance is up there, about to start looking. Perseverance, the rover that went up a couple of months ago, is just getting used to its new environment up here in Jezero Crater. Here you can see a delta coming down into this volcanic crater, this meteorite crater. The place that the rover should head for is over here. These are the sediments deposited around the margin of this lake that was here once, the delta here built into the lake, but around the edge of the lake. And this bluish color, it's artificial, of course, it's been colored, this image has been colored. This is an area they reckon where there are carbonates. And of course, as we've been saying, where you get carbonates, you might well have had microbes and viruses as well. And here's a lake in California, Mono Lake in California near Los Angeles, where around the margin of this lake, we have carbonate deposits. These are produced from springs coming out into the lake, and these are all microbial, probably with umpteen viruses as well. So this is what they're looking for. And as I've said, where there's life, there will be viruses. So watch this space. Okay, so just to conclude, viruses do become fossilized. And if they can be fossilized, and we've shown that in QATAR, then you can follow them back through the geological record. Nobody has done that yet. Now's the time to start. And what we suggest is that viruses are much more important than we think, and they are the seeds for precipitation of carbonate to form limestones, but also other minerals, like iron minerals, phosphate minerals, silica as well. So viruses can be instrumental in forming rocks. We need to explore the role of viruses in extinction. That's something which hasn't really been tackled at all. And I say, viruses completely neglected in earth sciences. They must have played some roles. Viruses, the new frontier. So thank you very much. This picture just illustrates me working hard on my field work. In this case, we're in Venezuela on a little sandbank looking and collecting some carbonate sand. And I think that is my last picture. Yes, there we are. Thank you very much. So I will stop my share. There we are. Do you want me to carry on talking? Hello.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's an outstanding talk. I knew you were going to give us an absolute roller coaster, and my goodness, what information you packed in there, completely offering us an absolutely new perspective on viruses. It's absolutely astonishing. Thank you very, very much. I love the way that you explain everything so clearly. Your slides are beautiful to look at, easy to understand. You put a lot of work into this, and I really appreciate that. Now, we do have quite a lot of questions for you from the chat room. So I'm going to kick off with one from Basfer Blankton. If viruses existed before bacteria and cells, how did they replicate? given that they need bacteria and cells to do that?
Yeah, that sounds like a good question for a microbiologist. Well, I mean, this is all part of evolution, isn't it? That these chemicals, if you like, organic chemicals, before life really began, these very complicated chemicals were being produced within a small pond or whatever, or even in the deep sea, black smokers and so on. And those chemicals were able in some way to replicate as an intermediate stage leading to the formation of life itself. It's not really something I could explain, but we, in the sense that the viruses do need the host, but what some people have suggested is that the viruses are forming at the same time as life is developing, so that they're like rogue elements, and found that they needed to have a host from which they could develop. But that's really a question for somebody who's much more involved with evolution at the very early stage than I am.
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you for your inspiring, great talk. Really appreciate it.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. Now, Maurice, can you actually see the chat questions on the side of your screen?
Yes, yeah, I'm looking at them. Yeah.
Oh, so I don't need to read those out.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't, probably other people, or what do you want me?
Yes. Okay, so from Andrew Ward, for everyone, would a mineralized virus form a hollow sphere of mineral? And could this prove their origin?
That could happen. In fact, I think that does happen with in the example of viruses being replaced by silica, by being silicified, that a coat does form around the virus. So there you could have the spheres could be hollow. The only difficulty there is that if you actually have a coating of the virus, then you're going to lose that slightly odd shape of the virus with the spherical but with flat sides. If it was coated, then I think you'd lose that. And we do know that nanospheres, small spheres, can develop purely abiotically, purely without any bacteria present. People have carried out experiments. So we know that these with and without bacteria. So the difficulty would be you would lose that shape. So what we're really looking for are places where the virus itself has been replaced by the mineral, so we can still see the original shape.
I overlooked it that Andrew had also asked, if viruses are all negatively charged, how come they cluster together?
Yeah, that's a good question, but you do find that. Yeah, that's a good one. Well, not something I have an answer for, I'm afraid. I shall ask one of my microbiologist chums if they got an answer. But it's something we see happen. I mean, I'm wondering, it even happens when I showed a picture of viruses themselves which had coalesced. So maybe the charge is not so strong so that they do just come together for company. Who knows? Who knows?
Now, Geraldine Beattie has asked, I've heard about marine snot being a great problem around Turkey. Is this another sort of bacterial bloom with viruses? Yeah,
undoubtedly. Yes, yes. Yes, I mean, people will obviously be drawn to the role of bacteria. I mean, the bacteria are much larger than the viruses. The bacteria will form the biofilm, which I showed you the examples from the Roman baths. So that's something you can actually pick up, and you can see it's slimy and it's filamentous. So that is the bacteria. Sometimes there are algae there as well, which are slightly thicker. But so but there will be loads, twice the number of bacteria. There will be viruses in there as well. So yes, it's a complete mixture, and you'll probably find there are more viruses than bacteria in that Turkish snot. Yeah.
Mm. Well,
all because of too many nutrients. That's the problem. You see, that's where the nutrients come in. Probably some runoff, maybe some rain, bring in some fertilizer or some phosphate into the sea. It's a bit of a small sea, the Sea of Marmara. So that's exactly the sort of thing that we see in the Bahamas, that nutrients are coming in, and so the bacteria grow with the viruses.
Thank you. Another nice question from, excuse me if I've got your name, if I pronounce it wrong, but Cliff McLaren. What made you look for viruses?
Well, we were looking at the microbial map with the scanning electron microscope in great detail, trying to see the crystals, and we noticed all these tiny nanospheres there. So we wondered what they could be. People have seen them before, but never suggest the link to viruses. So once we started looking into it, we realized that was the most likely explanation. The viruses should be, they have to be present. So it's the most likely explanation, but one that nobody ever thought of.
All right, good. Now, a question that I want to put to you.
Yeah.
If the limestone originates from algal blooms, which then are infested with the viruses that then precipitate the calcium carbonate,
yeah,
given we've got vast quantities of chalk and limestone globally, where does all the calcium carbonate originate?
Well, the calcium comes from the weathering of rocks on the land and rocks under the sea, especially volcanic rocks and other. There's plenty of calcium in rocks, and that calcium can be liberated by weathering processes, rain, sun, rivers, etc. And the calcium can be transported into the sea, and over the millennia, over the millions of years, the calcium builds up within the sea. Must have built up in the first 500 million years, because that's the Earth formed 4.5 million years ago, 4,500 million years ago, and by about 4 billion years ago, we start to see the first limestones up in Greenland, and then we're thinking about the same time we start to get life. So the calcium basically is coming out of erosion and weathering of rocks, ultimately produced by volcanic activity. And the carbonate, well, the carbonate's carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere, and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, much of that, historically at least, has come from volcanic activity. Now that we're helping, unfortunately, but the volcanic activity actually produces huge quantities of carbon dioxide. And you've got volcanic activity, of course, all around the world. Back in the first 500 million years of the Earth, there was lots of activity going on. And eventually, of course, plate tectonics started. So the volcanic activity is concentrated in particular places. Ring of fire and volcanoes can be explained. But that's where the carbon dioxide will be from volcanic activity, and the calcium from erosion of the various hard rocks.
You make it all sound so sort of interesting. Your students must love your enthusiasm, and you have an answer for everything.
Not always the right answer.
No,
anyway,
but you say it with such conviction and interest, and it's good. Thank you. Yeah. Question from Dick Bateman. Have we got any idea yet of whether there is more virus mass in recent rocks than in ancient ones?
Yeah, that's a clever question. Well, the answer, of course, is no. Nobody's been thinking about viruses. People think about bacteria. They have been thinking about bacteria for a long time, and of course, viruses go with bacteria. But so if you think of the Earth, from about 4 billion years ago until 600 million years ago, Cambrian, beginning of the in the Precambrian. In the Precambrian, we really only had bacteria, and therefore we had viruses too. So for something like 70% of Earth's history, it's all been bacterial, microbial. And I suppose you might think, therefore, more rocks then are the result of, well, they are the result of bacterial, microbial, viral activity compared with the last 600 million years when other organisms started to evolve, shells and corals and all the other things. So then there are other organisms contributing towards the formation of limestones. So yeah, possibly, yeah, possibly there is.
Now,
yeah.
Anthony Symes, here's a good one. Could we use viruses somehow to precipitate calcium carbonate for carbon capture purposes to mitigate climate change?
Yeah, I guess one could. Well, in one way or another, theoretically one could, yeah. Yes, well, of course, viruses and bacteria, they are extracting calcium carbonate. They're extracting carbon dioxide. Yeah, people have been talking about that sort of thing, seeding the ocean and getting calcite to precipitate. But of course, there are other people who think it's a bit dangerous to start messing around with nature. We've been doing it too long already, but to start doing things drastic, like seeding the oceans, might be a step too far. But I think in theory, yeah. I mean, I mean, when we're seeing this connection between viruses and precipitation, then one of my colleagues was approached by a pharmaceutical company in terms of using viruses as a way of transporting medicines, something like that. But so, I mean, then, you know, once you start to realize there's that, and our experiments are showing this, that viruses can precipitate material, then, well, there's some potential, perhaps.
All right. Well, I haven't got any more questions in the chat room at the moment, but I've got a couple that I'd like to put to you. First one is, when we find nanobacteria in rock cores extracted from as much as 1,000 meters underground with these virus particles, do you suppose that those are relics of geological subduction, or perhaps, like the nanobacteria, they may have actually evolved there?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking on my feet here because it's outside my area of expertise. But I think well, it depends what rocks they're in, I suppose. If they're in sediments, and there's a lot of sediment that goes down the subduction zone, then I imagine that the bacteria and the viruses go down in that sediment, and they continue to evolve as they come into a different environment further down in the subduction zone. So I imagine that they are relics. They are evolved from organisms that were existing, and they are evolving to live at those greater depths. That's what I imagine. Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, they're clever, these things.
I'm with you on that. It seems easier to explain their presence by the fact that they're carried down there somehow.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But it is remarkable what is being found at significant depths, 4 or 5 kilometers down. They are finding still evidence of life. But in many cases, of course, it's not within the rocks. It's within fractures within the rocks.
Yes.
Because nearly in many cases with life, you need water, you need some fluid. And if the fractures, though, do go down very deep. So I think it's not like the life is distributed throughout all the rocks at depth. I think it's more related to these fractures.
Okay, I've got one last one for you. I've been fascinated by all your scanning electron micrographs of these particles and the evidence that you're presenting that these almost certainly are fossilized viruses.
Yeah.
But it rings a bell with me that in 1984, there was the Allen Hills Martian meteorite, which attracted
yes.
attention because that contained these nanoparticles, which people said resembled fossilized nanobacteria.
Yes. Yes.
And there was lots of evidence saying it's similar in this for this point or for that point. But it was putting it all together, it was strong evidence, but it couldn't be conclusive. Do you feel now that there is any geological similarity between that meteorite and the terrestrial stromatolites that you're seeing, and such as those that NASA's Perseverance rover on Mars is sort of tasked to look out for?
I think what we will be expecting to find on Mars, basically, is something similar to what we have on Earth in terms of the microbialites and the stromatolites type thing. I think that's what people are expecting to see. And there are supposed hot springs there, so we might see travertine type mounds building up. But I think one of the problems with the meteorite and the nanobacteria was the fact they were thinking that was evidence of life. And as I understand it, most nanobacteria have been dismissed as actual living once particles because they're too small, and you can't get all the bits and pieces of a bacterium within this nanobacterial size. But the size of those nanobacteria, those nanospheres, is very similar to the size of the mineralized viral particles. So that makes you wonder whether that's what they are, or is it a different form of life that's come on the meteorite? It's very difficult to say, because I mean there's a lot of these look like this, they look like that. It's very difficult to prove that one actually does have mineralized viruses or even mineralized bacteria, which are somewhat bigger. Very difficult to prove.
Maurice, thank you very, very much for a stunning lecture. I think we're all going to go away now with questions sort of brimming up and saying, oh, I wish I'd asked him about such and such. You lead a fascinating project on so many spheres, and one thing that really comes across to me is your students must be thrilled to have you there to sort of teach them all these wonderful things. I loved your last slide showing you on the beach, and you think, yes, what a good job you have.
Yeah, all right.
Maurice, thank you very much on behalf of everybody. And if people want to unmute themselves and put their cameras on, I think you deserve a something good round of applause.
Okay, well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.